Yeah, sure. Yeah, just briefly, my name's Luke. I work at Frontier Developments, a game studio in the UK that specialise mostly in AA games. We've done the Planet franchise, the Elite Dangerous, the Jurassic games, and a few big titles soon to be released. I've worked in the games industry for 7 years now, I guess. I've worked at very big studios, very small studios, mostly on PC and console games, but I've done a little bit of mobile development as well. Um, and yeah, I think that's probably it. So I wanted to get into games since I was a little kid. Honestly, I've very much enjoyed video games my whole life, and yeah, when I was very young and trying to work out what I kind of wanted to do with my life, I just knew I wanted to do something to do with video games. Didn't really know the kind of route that I wanted to take at the time, but yeah, since very young, since I guess pre-teen. So getting into production was kind of a complete accident, really. While I was at university, I took a sandwich year to start a company, and I started up a digital marketing agency and web development company because at the time I was a programmer. Um, but kind of growing that company and doing a lot more kind of planning and management of people rather than coding myself, I kind of realized that I enjoyed that a lot more, and the type of problems that I like to solve were much more related to kind of people and the kind of stuff that you maybe can't just Google the answer to. And it just kind of made me think, I'd like to give that kind of role a go in games if it existed, because unfortunately, even up to university level, production doesn't tend to be a role that gets talked about a whole lot, and it's maybe not understood that well, and is easily kind of missed off when you're thinking of the kind of core teams that put together games. So once I'd kind of looked into it a bit more and kind of realized that it matched the kind of project management and people management kind of vibe that I was really enjoying while I was running my company, I kind of thought, this is the kind of thing in games that I'd like to do moving forward. No, we sold it a few years ago because I tried to run it for a little while as like a on the side thing, but it was very difficult to focus on more than one thing, and a lot of professional studios will want you to sign contracts when you first join that kind of confirm that your focus is that job. Obviously, because they're paying you a salary, so they don't want your concentration to be split anywhere. So there's a bit of a conflict of interest anyway, and yeah, I was much more into games than I was into web development. So yeah, we sold it on. So concrete examples of just the kind of stuff that you do as a producer. This is like the most difficult question I get asked related to my job, because the kind of daily role of a producer just doesn't really exist. Like, there's not a standard set of things that you'll do, and within a company, even every producer will have a slightly different role, and between different development studios, producers do very, very different things. Um, so it's really difficult to kind of give an overall, this is what a producer does. Um, the way that I try to summarize it usually is it's kind of a mix between your kind of standard project management, so that's looking at short and long term plans with teams as to what you're trying to achieve, what is the game that you're trying to achieve, what's the feature you're trying to do, what is the kind of next steps that you want to make with something, and how do you get there, and how's that going to fit in the time that you have allocated to that. In addition to being able to like prioritize if you're not going to manage to do something, or if something's taking less time or more time than you're expecting to, what would kind of give the game the most bang for buck, because sometimes you won't be able to do everything that you originally planned, so you kind of need to be able to boil things down from a high level as to what is the core gameplay loop here, what is really important for the player to be able to have fun with this, and what is maybe really nice but it's okay if we have to ship with this or even just not do it at all. Then the other kind of core part of a producer's role is I like to call it communication facilitation, and that's it sounds like the most trivial thing ever. Like essentially just making sure that certain people talk to each other about certain things at certain times. But sometimes those conversations can be super important to happen, and it's and anybody knows it's quite easy to forget to talk to people about things, just even in your social life. But when multiple conversations like that need to happen a day, and the whole game that you're working on hangs in the balance as to whether those kind of conversations happen, and the methods and mediums in which those conversations happen, it's really important for a producer to just be the one to make sure that it does, and make sure that everything moves smoothly, and make sure that a meeting is as short as it can possibly be, and doesn't kind of trail off, so that as much time is spent on development rather than talking about development as possible. There's a huge number of other parts that go on for a producer, and there's so many different things that you could be doing in a day, but we would be here for hours probably if I were to try and list all of those off. But essentially the way that you should look at it is a producer is just the person that makes sure that as you're moving through development, you're getting from A to B as smoothly as possible. And regardless what that means at the time, that is the job of the producer, creatively solving those problems as you move from A to B. Sorry, the chat also said, are you in charge of team building events? That is, it can be part of the producer's role. Yeah, it entirely depends on the studio itself. In my career, I've tended to find that the bigger a studio is, the less a producer would be in charge of that kind of thing. You'd probably be the one to raise that kind of thing up at a big company and suggest that it should be done, and kind of help push that along if you feel like it's necessary. But usually you have entire departments that deal with that kind of thing. And at smaller companies, yeah, you would be the one in charge of making sure that morale stays up, and either supporting everybody in the team or just supporting the lead or the manager of that team to just make sure that those events happen and that they're kind of successful and positive. So there's a load of different ways. Honestly, for me personally, I went straight into production from university. So in my last year of university, I worked with teams on university projects and on just projects outside with other developers that I knew, to put kind of small games together, get them released, and kind of get them out there and on portfolios, so that we could kind of use the fact that we'd released games as something to get our foot in the door. And for me, that worked really well, because at networking events, I could just show the kind of games that we'd released and the platforms that we'd released on, and that was what ended up getting me interviews to start off with. But if you don't go straight in as a producer, you can go in as pretty much any other role when you go into games, and kind of work your way over to production. And it does tend to be a role that just suits people that are quite good and interested in leadership, regardless of what they're doing. It tends to be quite common that people will move from QA, or specifically QA leadership, into production. I think there's a lot of kind of shared skills there, and there tends to be a lot more roles at studios for QA than there are for producers. So the roles that you can apply for just make it make more sense to go in for QA. Not necessarily aiming to get into production, but I think a lot of people that go into QA and can't necessarily find a way into QA leadership kind of realize that their skills also match production, and kind of move over from there. But it also happens from other roles. Like a couple of the producers I work with now, one was a lead animator before moving into production. Another was a principal concept artist. So I think it it takes all types, and I think the role just suits people who enjoy leadership, enjoy kind of making people happy, enjoy removing barriers from developers to be able to move forward, and just like to be able to um, be involved in as many different areas within production as possible. Because obviously, as a producer, especially on smaller teams, you're going to end up touching pretty much every feature and every asset that kind of goes through a development cycle. So you'll kind of have a more overall view of a game as it moves through its cycle, rather than specifying in one like area like a lot of developers will. This is also a super difficult question to answer. I think it's a mix of a couple of things. I think being a strong positive motivator is a big thing that you need to have as a leader. Just being able to put on the right face at the right time, have the right tone at the right time, and be able to not hide things from a team, but definitely be able to look at the positives in any situation and build your team's focus around those positives rather than any issues that you might have at the time. Being a strong communicator across multiple platforms, I think, also is a very important thing. Being able to also understand the psychology behind that communication, and knowing the correct style of communication you want to use for certain people and in certain situations, as well as being able to alter your tone and the way that you maybe word things, and the level of detail of the information that you present to certain people at certain times is super important. And I think strong leaders just kind of have that kind of thing. They'll just, I guess, have the right level of empathy to understand how to change their communication style as they talk to different people in different ways. And then I guess lastly, I would just say that great leaders do tend to just be very assertive people. Tend to have like a lot of gumption. They tend to be the kind of people who will always find a way. They'll always be able to creatively get around, especially interpersonal problems with creative problem solving, and be able to not necessarily avoid situations, but stop certain situations from arising by being able to see the risk of them early on and moving on those. Sure. Is that as in like development roles? You mean like going from? Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's not. I don't want to say like it's easy or it's difficult. It's I guess you would just apply for a job the same as you would any other, regardless of the fact that it's internal. You would tend to just apply as if you didn't work at a certain company, unless you were super high up, and you would just be interviewed by that separate department. So it's I'd say it's no more easy or difficult than it would be kind of applying for any kind of role. Obviously, there is an amount of difficulty that's reduced by already being at a company, because you already understand the way that they work. You understand internal processes and internal like acronyms. So that there is some level of it being slightly easier in that sense, I guess. But it would still be a like. I don't know of any development studio where you could be working in one role and then just like want to do something else and just be switched over to it. You'd still need to be to have the skills that are required to do it. And I'm sure that studio would help you gain them if you were intent on kind of changing those roles. But yeah, I wouldn't say it's any more easy or difficult than any other application process, really. Yeah, absolutely. A lot of a lot of producers still will have a portfolio to some degree, just kind of because it's weirdly expected of everybody that works in games, I guess. But it's nobody ever looks at them. They're entirely like your own your own kind of little space to put things on. Really, the focus is entirely on CV and cover letter. Mostly CV, I would say. Cover letters just kind of allow you to give that extra bit of personality and flair to an application to explain who you are and why you think you'd work well in the company and work well with the team that they've got. But yeah, the CV is the most important thing for me, personally speaking, when I'm hiring. It's just portfolios just aren't a massive thing to see, because everything that you could have worked on previously that would be interesting to have in a portfolio is quite an easy thing to just kind of write down, and I would rather just see a couple of words than have to flick through a portfolio and see a bunch of stuff around a game just to know that a person has been the one that ran a demo for it or whatever. It's much easier to just kind of see that written down, because it's easy to understand those kind of processes. Yeah. So I guess there's a couple of things that would kind of be the main standouts. One is just look into the core hard and soft skills required for production, but even just general leadership roles, and being able to kind of mention those on a CV is super important, because seeing that kind of stuff and having someone not just say like, I'm a great communicator, but be able to explain, maybe I showed my communication skills in X role by doing Y, is a really great thing to see, and especially if it's quite like a unique situation. Like one that I've had in the past was having to deal with a certain lead programmer at one of my previous studios that wouldn't talk to me or anyone else unless we messaged them through Steam. It was a really weird situation, but being able to say that you can kind of find solutions to problems like that, and then make the most of them and understand why it was a problem in the first place is a really strong thing to see. General training on stuff like, I'm sure everybody's heard it a huge amount, but agile methodologies, specifically like the Scrum framework and Kanban, they're really important to see on a CV, and again to be able to give examples of using those frameworks on any projects that you've used. That's a really important thing to see in a production CV, and there's huge amount of resources that you can find online to kind of self-teach on those kind of things if you don't want to do like a full training course on them. They are fairly kind of simple to understand at a core level, and they're kind of something that's basically expected within games production. Not to say that every company uses it properly, because I don't think any do, but being able to understand the core pillars of those kind of frameworks will help you understand how a company has changed them to work with the way that they work, and that's just a really important thing to have. Software experience as well is really good to have on there, specifically project management software. The big one that always comes up is Jira. Most companies either use it, have used it, or use an alternative to it that's slightly cheaper. So it's being able to understand how it works, why it's good at what it does, why it's kind of used so widely, and how you can kind of make the most of it as a producer is a really important thing to have on a CV as well. And then I guess the last thing, the kind of main bit of advice I always like to give for production CVs is make sure that you include everything that has anything to do with production on it, even if it's roles outside of games. If you haven't had a lot of games roles previously, to include those roles as working experience and explain not like exactly what you did for the job, but what overlaps skill-wise with production. Because that kind of happens in all sorts of roles in all different industries. So there's always some bits to be had there. And also just mention separately from a career history any projects that you've been a part of and exactly what you did production wise for those projects. I saw a thread on it recently that was blowing up quite a lot on Twitter from some recruiters in games that were talking about how it's important not to list your previous project experience as work experience, because it comes across really badly, especially if you say, I worked at studio whatever, and really that's just like the group name for you and some friends at university, or just in a group of people that you found online. The experience itself is excellent and we want to see it, but no recruiter is going to want to spend a bunch of time on Google trying to find a studio just to find out that it doesn't exist, and it's just kind of what you called the name of your group project or whatever. So just have that separately in a projects section and explain what you did production wise for putting that game together, especially if that includes releasing something. That is absolutely huge. Even if it's not, the game itself isn't necessarily like finished and perfect, if you can release, especially on a reasonably big platform like Google Play or the App Store, or Xbox is quite accessible now on Partner Center. So just something like that, it's massive to have on a CV as someone kind of trying to break into the industry. I hope that answered that question. Sorry, I'm being a bit of a boast. It as in games, you mean, right? Yeah, so it overlaps with pretty much every lead role. The leads of specific departments are there to manage the people in those departments, and that obviously includes managing the level of motivation and everything else that comes with a general team. And there's a huge amount of overlap between that and production. Managing backlogs and stuff, also huge overlap between production and leads. It's going to differentiate between every studio that you look at. But yes, some will expect production to do a lot of the backlog refinement. Some will expect a lot from the leads, and others will there is no guideline. It's just always split between the two. And that goes for like every discipline, from art, code, QA, animation, everything. It's all kind of shared. And then I guess there's some overlap as well with like heads of departments. If you're at a much smaller company, a lot of the head of department roles are kind of split between a lot of whatever production you've got at that company. A lot of their kind of work tends to be splitting resources between various projects, making sure that people are happy with what they're working on, all that kind of stuff. And that tends to fall to production if you don't have heads of department, which is pretty common for studios under like 100 people. Yes. Yeah. So again, I would make sure that you list those projects, and specifically what you've done for those projects, and then getting the experience in a game studio. It's there's no kind of like easy way to do it. There's no like secret to it. It really is just applying to as many places as you can. Making sure that you get your personality across to them, you show what you've managed to do, get to networking events, because speaking to people that already work in industry is a really good way to kind of get your face out there and make interview processes and stuff a lot easier. And also being able to speak to people that exist in studios already is a good way to create a job if it doesn't necessarily exist. I was mentioning earlier, my first job came from showing off some games that we'd released at networking events, and someone that turned up to one of those networking events just happened to be the head of production at a smallish studio. So I showed off the games, talked about what I did, made a good impression, and then just made sure that I swapped business cards with him. And his business card had his email, and then I would email him every week or so with a little bit of an update with the games that we've done and how sales figures were looking, and any new releases we were aiming to do, and asking some questions about releases and stuff sometimes. And then every now and again I'd just slip in, if there's any roles going in your studio around the time that I graduate, it would be great to come and talk or whatever. And that's where my first interview came from. Then there's also just I can't remember the phrase for it now. You can apply at studios if they haven't got any work, any roles going at the time, just as a kind of general application, and say, I know you're not looking for anything at the moment, but I'd love to do either work experience or internship or whatever at your studio. This is what I do, and this is what I think I could bring to your team or to a project that you're working on, and just kind of get your foot in the door like that. Because even if it's like they say they'll take you on for like 4 weeks or something, and it would be like unpaid or not particularly well paid, just to help cover something, that experience on your CV immediately puts you above like hundreds of other people for introductory roles. Plus, if once your foot's in the door and you're working at that studio, if they like you and you do a good job, there's always a really good chance that like 4-week internship turns into full employment on full salary and everything else. So yeah, it's unfortunately there's no like secret I can give you guys as like this is like the key or whatever. It literally is just keep applying. Don't worry don't always expect a reply. Don't feel bad if you get rejections or whatever. It takes a lot of applying and speaking to the right people before you start getting opportunities, and it's just a case of making the most of those opportunities when they come. Especially now that so many studios offer remote positions as well, there shouldn't be anything stopping you from applying to pretty much any studio and saying that you can work remotely. That was always a difficulty when I was entering the industry, that obviously you were expected to work from the studio, so you could only really apply at places nearby or places that you could move to. But now you can go anywhere. So just keep applying, and you'll get responses eventually. Probably not, to be honest. It definitely helps you get your foot in the door. It definitely helps with getting your first role. If you're the kind of person that wants to freelance or move around a lot, it's very important to keep doing. And if you're kind of early on in your career and you want to work somewhere specific, then trying to network with the right people will always help. But I think, honestly, my career progress is mostly from mentoring and just trying to. I've previously always picked studios to move to, not necessarily because I loved their work or I was a super fan of their games, but because the hiring manager was someone who was very experienced that I felt like I could learn a lot from. Like, for example, I had never previously aimed to work in mobile games, like I mentioned earlier, but I worked for a mobile studio for 6 months, entirely because the hiring manager was a very, very, very well-renowned and very well experienced Sega director of production, and was literally just, I think he was just had decided to do kind of like not necessarily odd jobs, but kind of try a few smaller things so that he could move around in the area he was in. So yeah, the opportunity to work under someone like that was just way more important to me than necessarily what the studio was doing at the time. So I think that's been a large part of it, just picking the right mentors and learning from people where you can. Yeah, for sure. It's just taking any opportunity to learn. And as you said, people in games that obviously I can't say everyone, like we can't really say that, but the bulk of people that I know that work in games are always more than happy to speak to anyone that's wanting to get into games and give advice where they can. Um, and they tend to go to quite a lot of networking events, even if it's just to see other developers. Because obviously, we don't get to meet up that often anymore. You end up working with a lot of people that you get very close with, but that end up going off to work for other studios. So networking events are just a really good opportunity to catch up with those people. So if there are big networking events, you know there's always going to be developers there. So yeah, good opportunity to catch them and pick their brains about things. Honestly, just anything games industry related. Um, the biggest one is in the UK at least has just gone, which was Develop. But even stuff that's kind of more consumer focused, like the EGX and Res or WSD or whatever it's called now, those kind of events, even though they are more focused on kind of selling games and selling I don't want to call it toys, but you know what I mean, like everything that kind of comes along with it. You do tend to find a lot of devs go to those because everyone that's working at an indie will want to go and show up if their game's being showcased on an indie showcase. They might not necessarily wear a T-shirt that has dev written in massive letters on it, but going and talking to people on stands, you do tend to end up finding other devs in places like that, and you can get talking to them about that kind of stuff, especially if you're passionate about the game that they've worked on. And then the more local meetups, they're quite difficult to find nowadays, which is unfortunate. But pretty much anywhere where there's more than one studio, you'll find like a pub or a bar somewhere around the area that will host like a weekly or fortnightly dev meetup. Yeah, they can be a little bit more difficult to find. Sometimes they have like Facebook groups or people like mention them on Twitter or whatever. But yeah, they're kind of good opportunities to go and talk to those people. Obviously, they're there to relax and stuff, so it's you shouldn't go and bombard people with stuff. But like we said earlier, games developers are usually happy to speak to anyone, so they'll be more than happy to give you some of their time, so long as you're respectful of theirs. Yeah, so social and interpersonal problems are kind of some of the most common issues that you end up having to solve working in production. So being able to understand why a person is speaking or acting in a way that they are, seeing ahead of time the risk that could cause to others by them acting in that certain way or saying certain things, and responding to that as soon as possible is very, very important. Issues like that just tend to be like we call them like a dripping pipe issue. It's not like the biggest problem in the world, but if you leave it and ignore it and hope that it'll go away, it's just going to keep getting worse until it explodes. So yeah, it's really important to have social skills and be able to pick up on those kind of social cues between people, and solve them as soon as possible. That's been really interestingly affected by working from home. Obviously, with COVID happening and most people moving to working remote, at least for a year, and in some cases still now, instead of the kind of standard issues of person X is sat next to person Y, but they differ massively, like politically or on an opinion on something or whatever. You don't have that anymore because people are remote. But what you do have is certain people finding it very difficult socially, I guess, to connect with others on a team. I mean, I think everybody here would have experienced like talking to someone on a text chat platform, and kind of feeling that a person they're talking to is speaking in a certain way or with a certain tone, even though they're not necessarily doing that, and then you kind of I've lost the word. What am I trying to say? Yeah, but you're putting a personality onto someone that they don't necessarily have, or you're putting the feelings that you think that they have for you onto them over this text platform because of the way that you're reading into what they're saying, and that kind of thing can happen as well when you have um, meetings with people. I guess kind of like this when there's not a camera shared, and so you can't pick up on someone's facial expressions, so you don't. There is some level of tone to their voice, but you don't necessarily know how they're reacting to something, or you don't know what their silent reactions are, right? I can't see if someone rolls their eyes or yawns or whatever. And that kind of thing can be taken really personally if someone does or doesn't see it and takes it in a certain way that it's not necessarily meant. So being able to kind of see those things happen and react socially and talk to those people or discuss things with individuals to make sure that they don't think something's being said in a certain way is just it's very important now because of the way that we have to work. Hope that answers that. I personally don't necessarily think it's damaging. Um, the experiences that we've had at Frontier is that we've released games since we've had to move to work from home. Uh, a couple of years ago or whenever it was that everything happened. So we know for a fact that things can still work out, and lots of studios in the UK are still focused on remote work and allowing people to join as entirely remote workers. I'm not remote, but I only go to the office like once a month, maybe once every couple of months. And I don't feel like it's impacted my work at all. Obviously, the job itself has changed ever so slightly because there are slightly different skills and slightly different things to kind of pick up on. But I feel like we did really well to adapt to that. We had quite a lot of training early on to make sure that we could pick out these kind of issues and adapt to them. And I think that worked really well. And yeah, honestly, from my personal view, not speaking as the company, is just that remote work I think is going to continue to be the future for games. It just makes a lot more sense. You can get people together and working much quicker. You get a much better outside of work kind of life standard because you're not having to spend a load of time traveling and a load of money traveling, which is just a huge improvement for a lot of people, especially myself. Like it takes me an hour or so to get into the office, so that's a couple of hours a day that I just have back that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And it also, well, it had started to make hiring a lot easier as well, because instead of having to worry about people taking the time to like move house or move countries, even sometimes you could kind of have someone join the company and be working very quickly. That's not as much of a case now because of the situation that we've got currently with working visas for people in pretty much every country outside of the UK, which is very difficult. But we can still get people up and running a lot faster than we ever have before with remote work. So yeah, I personally don't think there's been any damage done to the industry for it, and I think we'll continue the way that we are. And I say we, as in the industry, not necessarily just Frontier. Yeah, for sure. And don't get me wrong, it's not everyone. And there are a lot of the kind of much bigger studios that maybe aren't adapting to it so much. I think there are certain people in positions of power that have the feeling that in-office work is much better than remote work, and so are kind of pushing those things through. But I think that's something that's going to die off, as we move forward, because as an prospective dev, if you were applying at a number of places and all of them were remote bar one, it would take a lot for that non-remote studio to be able to convince you to work there, because it would be so much easier to work at any of the others. So yeah, I think it's going to be very difficult for them to keep competing with other studios if they don't adapt in this way. It's a little bit different. Um, I feel like I have the same or more interaction with the teams that I'm directly dealing with at any one time. My job has become like 80 to 90% meetings every day, which it's different, but it's not something I'm necessarily against, because it's something that needs to happen for us to be able to work properly in this way of working. But yeah, I definitely see a lot less of people that are focused on teams that I wouldn't necessarily be a part of usually. So, and for the most part, production roles are split into either focused on discipline teams or focused on feature teams. So, depending on your position, you would have a number of disciplines or a number of features that you'd be focused on at any one time. In my current role, it's features, and I've got quite a lot of the ones for the project that I'm working on. But there's a couple of areas of the game that I don't really touch at all as a producer. And there can be people that come onto the project, and I won't have seen their face or sometimes even know who they are for it can be months, because if I don't have a reason to call them or be in a meeting with them, you just wouldn't see them, which is different to when we were in office, because you would just notice that there's a new face that's sat a couple of rows over or whatever, and go and introduce yourself and say hi or whatever. So yeah, that's definitely changed a little bit, but I don't necessarily think that's a terrible thing. It means that the relationships with the people that you have, that you are still communicating with, are a lot stronger than they were previously, in my opinion. So yeah, I don't necessarily see it as a bad thing. I don't think it's a great thing either, but I don't think it's a problem. Don't quit at your first rejection. um, uh, I think from what I hear from some people getting into the industry at the moment, and some of the people that I've been mentoring, it can be 40, 50, 60 applications that you're sending out before you even get a reply with a first interview. So don't be disheartened by either not hearing back or hearing rejections. Rejections are just part of it. You're applying for a job that there could be 100 other people applying for, so it's not like anything against you if you get rejected. It's just chance. It's just a roll of the dice. So don't take that personally. And if you don't hear back, it again can just be that particular studio, especially if they're small, they might not even have a recruitment team, and they're just expecting all the recruitment to be done by like an office manager who's already got a full-time job. So then if you're asking them to reply to 100 people with emails to say that they've been unsuccessful for something, it's just very difficult for them to get the time to be able to do that. And at some larger studios, you might not hear back just because if your CV doesn't make it past like a censor before it even gets in front of people, sometimes it'll either be an automated response or it won't be anything if they're not able to do that. So it's not nice, and obviously it'd be great if everybody could reply. And a lot of studios that don't reply, if you say something to them and ask for feedback, they quite often will. But yeah, just don't be disheartened by that. And I'd also suggest, when you're looking for your first role, try not to let, I don't want to say anything hold you back, because obviously everybody's got a moral standard that they want to stick to, but don't not apply at companies because they've worked on a game that you didn't particularly like or whatever. If they're a studio, they can be a foot in the door for the industry for you. And even if you don't feel like the interview would go particularly well, I would always suggest going for it anyway, because you get very, very, very good interview experience from being able to sit in an interview go through the whole thing and not be concerned about whether you get the job or not. And that will aid you so much in interviews later down the line, because you learn so much more from them. And I guess on top of that point, sorry to ramble, but if you're in an interview that you really do want, and you feel after 20 minutes or so it's not going so well, don't be disheartened. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's not going so well. It could just be a way that a certain person speaks that makes you think that. So just keep pressing on. And if you're certain it's not going to go so well, or you don't have answers for questions that they're asking you, ask them what they would be expecting you to say. Just turn it around and ask them, because it will probably mean that you won't make it through the interview, because if you're not able to answer those kind of questions, then it is what it is. But they will often give you that answer, and then when you move on to your next interview for someone else that could be going much better, you'll have that banked, and you can use that, and you can understand what the answer is for that question and why that's the answer. So you're only going to benefit from it, even if it doesn't go so well. Yeah, just keep going, and it can take a lot of applying, and it can take a lot of networking and everything else, but just don't give up on it, I guess, is the advice, because there's always the opportunity that someone will give you that chance, at least for an interview. I guess on top of that, sorry to keep going with this one, I'll just be really quick, but with your CV, don't be precious over it at all, and take it to as many opportunities as you can to get CV feedback from both peers and from people who work in industry, because so many people will be happy to help you with it, but you need to apply the feedback. Don't kind of go into a feedback session expecting someone to tell you that it's perfect, because everyone, even if it's really good, everyone's going to have a slightly different spin on it, so it's worth just hearing those people out and adapting it to the best it can be. A lot of the time there are things internally that we look for that educational institutions maybe don't realize are important. I've spoken to, I do quite a lot of talks for college students and for university students, and the amount of CVs that I've seen that have been rated really well by the college or university because they've ticked whatever boxes that the lecturer thinks is important, and I've gone through it and it's one of the worst CVs I've ever seen, and I have to change pretty much every single thing. That happens very, very, very regularly, so just make sure you keep getting feedback on those kind of things, because it could just be that your CV just isn't formatted right, and that's what's holding you back.